Good afternoon. One evening in the late 1950s, some 10 years plus before I was born, my parents put my two brothers, aged 18 months and 2.5 years, to bed, as they did every evening. My parents were blessed with two boys, and then later myself, who slept throughout the night. We were known and guaranteed to be the 12 hours a night children. Once confident that their sons were asleep, my parents left the house and went over the road to my aunt's house for an evening of food, a couple of drinks and some good company. Apparently they did this every weekend, and in those days this was not uncommon behaviour. Obviously, some 60 years has passed since the evening in the 1950s, and the precise time and the subject matter of the discussion of the evening have been lost to memory. But the main event of the night, as told to me by those who witnessed the event, remains fresh in my memory. At some point during the evening, and much to the surprise of my parents, my aunt produced an Ouija board. Again, I must state that I do not know when in the evening this occurred, or how the session on the board progressed. But what I have been told is at some point the planchette took on a different character, and with some force deliberately spelt out the words, "Go home," and then, "Your children need you." Somewhat astounded, and as I am told, if only to prove the messenger wrong, my parents returned home to check on my brothers. To say that their arrival was timely was putting it mildly. Both boys were not only wide awake, but in serious difficulty. One of my brothers had managed to get underneath his mattress and had his head wedged in the slats of the cot base, whilst the other had almost succeeded in getting out of his cot. However, he had become trapped between the two cots, and my parents found him hanging by his chin, his feet dangling, unable to gain purchase. Both boys were instantly released from their predicament, and knowing my father, I expect some strong words along the lines of, "and this time stay asleep," were said. Nevertheless, the truth of the matter was that had my parents not heeded the warning on the board, both boys would have probably suffocated. Over the years, I've thought on this family story many times. Could my aunt or my parents have manipulated the planchette? It is a possibility. But the probability of that message on that particular evening, the first evening when my brothers had woken, would be incredibly high. Could it have been telepathy? Again, it is a possibility. But the preciseness of the words spelt out on the board were far too grown up for a toddler to have expressed. This brings me to my third thought, which is, could a spirit have manipulated the board to warn my parents? My mother always believed that it was her grandmother who spelt out the warning, and nobody in the family ever contradicted her, and out of respect to my mum, I won't either. I had heard this story from my family before the film The Exorcist was released, but until the late 1970s, when I first watched the film, I didn't even know what an Ouija board looked like. When I first saw Captain Howdy communicate with Reagan, the image of my parents and my aunt using the board, their fingers on the planchette, made me smile. I could not for 1 second imagine my father, and it astounds me to this day that he did. Maybe the fact that the most unlikely candidate to use a board used it and was part of a session that saved his children's lives enhanced my interest in the board and its history. Initially, the local library answered a few of my questions, but it was not until the internet came into its own that I was able to truly fully research the origins of the good luck Ouija board. There are, it seems, many rules for using an Ouija board, and most of the rules seem to be about not using it in an environment that could lead to a heightened state of fear. Just a few of the rules that I have found on the internet include that you must never use it on your own. You must only ever use it in the dark, and you must never use it in a graveyard. Then there are the belief systems, which have led to a different set of rules, some stating that you must always open the board before use, and then definitely close the board afterwards. This is to ensure that the spirits do not use it as a portal and gain entry into our world after the board has been used. For me, my only rule has always been at the end of a session to simply say goodbye. Regardless of whether or not you apply any of these rules when using the board, the one obvious issue with using it is its notoriety for misuse and easy ability to manipulate the planchette to spell out whatever you want. For the past 10 years, I have run a small team of investigators who can be found under the name of ROPE, Researchers of Paranormal Events. We have frequently used the Ouija board on our investigations, but only ever use it with ourselves or with people we know and trust. Many years ago, at an event investigation, I once watched a young woman use the board, and she was clearly pushing the planchette. When a woman left the table in tears because the board had spelled out that her father had had an affair, I had seen enough and stepped in. It transpired that this young woman was in fact a minor and the daughter of the owner of the location. Once, in very strong terms, I had explained to her the potential consequences of her actions. She apologised, not only to me, but to all concerned, and left in tears. And this is the true danger of the Ouija board. It is not what might or who come through, but whether or not the users are trustworthy enough not to manipulate the board for their own malevolent entertainment. So then there are two questions which I feel must be answered. Firstly, does the board actually work? And if so, how do we prove it? In my opinion, the Ouija board is a tool that can be used in a paranormal investigation. It is no more or less reliable than a spirit box, a K2 meter, a geoport, an interactive EMF teddy bear or doll, automatic writing or transmediumship. Indeed, I once witnessed a transmedium allow the spirit of a well-known male inventor enter her body. Afterwards, when she regaled her experience, she was told that the character that she had described was completely different to the character of the gentleman, and whoever had spoken through her certainly wasn't him. This medium had, earlier in the evening, admonished me for using such a dangerous instrument as the Ouija board, as I had no control of who or what may come through. Evidence would suggest that neither did she. The Ouija board evokes a very strong response in people, and these can be collated into four loose categories. There are the non-believers. There are the believers who are terrified of the board and what it represents, and so will not go near one. Then there are the sceptical believers who use it but want to find the supporting evidence. And there are the complete believers who will accept everything that comes through on it. I consider myself to be a sceptical believer, who not only looks for the supporting evidence, but also believes that one's own psyche can have an effect on what the board produces, and this is why definite proof is needed. For too long, the board has been a subject of fear and ridicule. The film industry has branded the board, it seems, almost as the bringer of demons, when no good will ever come from using it. In fact, if you watch the films that include an Ouija board, a terrible death will await virtually all those who use the board. On the flip side, there are many who throw scorn at the board, stating that it is nothing more than a toy and only works due to the manipulation by those on the board, or at best by its influence, as described in the eidometer theory. In short, this theory states that those on the Ouija board session can unconsciously manipulate the planchette because of their feelings and emotions. Now, I am no scientist, I'll admit that, and I do see the reasoning behind this theory, but it only goes so far. Most questions asked on the board are generic and are easily open to interpretation. Is there anybody there? Can you tell me your name? And probably the most well-used question, how did you die? These questions, I believe, can be answered in two ways. Firstly, if we use the eidometer theory, then our imaginings will happily give us the answer. Secondly, if we accept, just for the moment, that the spirit is manipulating us to use the board, then the spirit can have a grand old time. The one thing that I have learnt since investigating the paranormal, that spirits can and will often lie. If we accept again, just for the moment, that the spirits are energies, souls, if you will, of our families and friends, then we must agree that the vast majority of them led very boring lives. They were not murderers, and nor were they murdered. They didn't commit atrocities, and they were not famous nor infamous. They were normal, everyday people living normal, everyday lives. Therefore, as a normal, everyday spirit being contacted by the living, why not tell a few porkies and spice things up a bit? If spirits were us, then they know us, and they know our hopes and fears. Whether or not you believe in the dark side of the paranormal, there is a little bit in all of us that wonder about the existence of negative entities that were never human to start with. Over the years, I have witnessed many times how spirits can play on our qualms and invoke our darkest of fears. Bear with me. Therefore, whether we are trying to disprove or prove the id-meter theory, the evidence given to us on the board and the knowledge that we acquire through the Ouija board we must set some form of parameter that we can measure the responses by. The issue is that the board cannot be a guaranteed method of communication, and therefore cannot be measured under laboratory conditions. As a spirit, I would not necessarily want to communicate in a stale or clean environment, because for many it would look too frightening and alien. To measure the accuracy of the board needs a method that is simple, easy to understand, and easy to quantify. And this, until approximately 5 years ago, was my quandary. For many years, I wanted to come up with a foolproof layman's experiment that would unequivocally show whether or not the movement of the planchette was caused by the person using the device, or whether it was being moved by another form of energy source. When I look back now, I realise that not only was I exceptionally supercilious to believe that I could prove something with such certainty, but I was also very naive, and so I decided to lower my expectations. I decided that an experiment that could show the potentially that using the Ouija board are not always either consciously or unconsciously manipulating the board and planchette. I therefore needed direct questions with an unknown answer that could be easily and quickly be double-checked. An easily repeatable experiment that could be quantified and verified and have no grey areas. Now, I would love to be able to say that this idea came to me in the dead of night or whilst using an Ouija board. But the truth of the matter is that the idea, like many others, came while sitting on the lavatory. While sitting there pondering, a vision suddenly came into my head. It was the scene from the Ghostbusters film where Dr. Venkman is conducting the ESP experiment using zenner cards, and slowly thoughts and ideas began to knit together. Those being experimented on could not see the cards, but Venkman could, instantly. If I was to combine the zenner cards with the Ouija board, strangely, the first thing I needed to do was actually purchase a pack of zenner cards. They arrived in time for an investigation at a local public house near the River Severn, and by the end of the evening, we were all astounded with the results. The method of the experiment is really very simple. Lay the 5 main zenner cards, the circle, the cross, the wavy lines, the square and the star, along one edge of the Ouija board. Take another of the same 5 zenner cards and behind your back, shuffle them. You can ask someone else to do this if numbers of people allow. Out loud to the spirits, invite them to help with the experiment. Explain that it is a very simple card experiment. Direct their attention to the 5 cards laid out on the board, and that you have the same 5 cards behind your back. Choose one random card and hold it up behind your back, ensuring that neither you nor anyone else living can see the card. Invite the spirit to look at the card you're holding and ask it to match it to the card on the Ouija board. After showing the card to the spirits, lay it face down on a non-reflective surface, ensuring that neither you nor anyone else can see the card. What happens next can and will vary. What you're hoping for is that the planchette will move towards a card and match it to the one, hopefully, that you have placed safely down on the surface. Before checking the card, ask the spirit to confirm its choice by moving the planchette again to the corresponding card. Once it has confirmed its choice, turn the card over and see if it matches. Repeat it a minimum of four times so that you can work out an overall percentage. That evening, when we first trialled the experiment, the spirit of a young man called Terry came through. Following the above method, we asked Terry to identify the card, and 4 out of 5 times he was correct. For the last 2 correct attempts, a member of the team that we had joined chose the cards while standing at the other side of the pub, which had a partition wall between us. He was watched by another team member choosing the card, and they confirmed that neither had seen the card. On each attempt, Terry chose correctly. Only on the last attempt did Terry make a mistake and choose incorrectly. I believe that this was because such was my delight at the experiment being so positive that my joyous shouts brought the rest of the team down from the upstairs area, causing a change in energies. I have been told, although I have yet to hear it, that when I asked Terry why he could not identify the last card, there was an EVP response that said, "I could not see it." With the exception of the downtime due to the pandemic, we have attempted this experiment at virtually every location we have investigated. But I must stress that the vast majority of the experiments have only ever been recorded on audible devices. If I'm honest, we've had very mixed responses, from 100% accuracy in multiple locations to 100% failures and multiple non-responses. In the case of the non-responses, we have voided the experiment, and these cases have not been included in our findings. The first year, our results showed a 54.54 success rate, which not only were we astounded at, but we were also amazed, as this rate was higher than the recorded rates of 32% that were recorded during the Ganzfeld experiments that were held in the 1980s. Over the past few years, the rates of success have dropped down to around the 30% mark. This does not surprise me, as we have conducted the experiment fewer times due to a change in the types of locations and investigations that we have explored. Though, even with this taken into consideration, I remain surprised, as the figures are still in keeping with the Ganzfeld results. However, there are some results and incidences that have occurred that have not been included within the figure. These include verbal reports from other teams stating that they have had multiple successes with the experiment, an incident at St Breville's Castle where, after the cards were laid out and the chosen card laid face down, a well-known spirit of the location knocked all of the cards off of the Ouija board and then spelt out the word boring. A separate incident where the spirit, instead of matching the chosen card to the card on the board, on 3 occasions correctly chose the top card from the remainder of the cards that had been laid to one side. And finally, various incidences where the spirit has changed its mind when confirming which card was being held up, thus rendering the experiment pointless. We have also varied the cards at some locations, exchanging them for children's flashcards, and again with varying results. The cards that I own have both the picture and the word on them, and the theory is that in using these, if the spirit cannot spell, then he or she can copy the word from the card and replicate it on the board. One of the first things that we learnt was not to put the circle and the square zenner cards together. We found that these, although not all the time, often were confused for each other. Initially, I would hold the card up, and then once I had placed it on the surface, I would then join the others on the board. In order to help stop any form of subconscious guesswork, if I hold up the card, I then do not go on the board now. If we use the children's picture cards instead of the zenner cards, then we select only pictures and words that firstly the spirit would recognise, for example, river, knife, tree, and also only have a maximum of 5 letters. My conclusions and contemplations. Firstly, I think it is important to stress that this experiment is just not my experiment or Rope's experiment. I would love more people to try this and report any findings back to myself. I would also love to see if there is a correlation between a belief system and an accuracy of the cards chosen. The first conclusion that I came to is that to try and prove or disprove a theory is not as easy as I first thought. This, however, works both for and against this experiment. The variables that are involved in calculating the accuracy of the experiment are too great, and I would go so far as to suggest that the eidometer theory would have the same issues. With our experiment, we are reliant on the planchette actually moving, the spirit or unknown energy source understanding the instructions, and the spirit or unknown energy source being willing to assist. The eidometer theory would state that these actions are not down to a spirit or unknown energy source manoeuvring the planchette, but our state of mind. Surely, every time we conduct the experiment, we would have a desire for it to work, and our desire should then translate into a subconscious movement that would push the planchette towards the card, any card. Yet this has not been our experience. It is only while I have been looking and listening back to our recordings that I have realised one potential correlation to our findings. We have always had more positive results in locations where there has been historically less animosity and is shown to be of a more supportive environment. For example, we have had no positive interaction during the experiment in any of the prisons that we have investigated. We have investigated HMP Gloucester multiple times, and each time we have had a 0 return rate. Nevertheless, other methods of communication have been more forthcoming. We have, however, had stronger and accurate interactions in many of the more collaborative locations, such as community and county halls, educational and medical establishments. When we have had positive and accurate interaction, we have been left astounded. Often we have asked the spirit to continue past the 5 attempts, and we have been lucky that they have agreed and the accuracy has continued. When there is no way that anyone with their finger on the planchette or blindly choosing a random card can replicate the accuracy sometimes 8, 9 or even 10 times in a row, then my scepticism begins to diminish. My final conclusion is one that may cause some discord. Since commencing with this experiment, Rope has, on various occasions, allowed other trusted investigators to join them on the board. One notable occurrence has happened. Each time someone has joined us who is either far more sceptical than ourselves, to the point of complete disbelief, or those who are more willing to accept that there could be another reason for this to happen outside of the eidometer theory, or even those who've never heard of the eidometer theory, one of two things occur. With the highly sceptical individuals, the Ouija board ceases to work. And with the more open individuals, there has been more movement from the planchette, and therefore a higher rate of accuracy when it comes to the zenner card experiment. I find it strange that one individual would have such an effect on the Ouija board session. Would the highly sceptical individual be subconsciously able to use the eidometer theory to hinder any message coming through from an outside source, or would their general negativity impact on the session as a whole? This seems to be a regular occurrence, not just on Ouija boards, but within the paranormal as a whole. The more sceptical the individual, the less paranormal activity they seem to witness. Maybe we should change our stance and become less sceptical and more objective. After all, those of us that are living tend to communicate more with those we know we will get a response from. I'm sure you would all agree that a one-sided conversation's a bloody hard work. Finally, I believe that we will never confirm the accuracy and true accuracy and authenticity of the Ouija board. But I do believe that there are times when a spirit or a source of energy from the outside of our consciousness and understanding can manipulate the planchette. I and many others have witnessed too many times far too accurate a piece of information come through on a board that was not known by those taking part. How the spirits do this, like many other things, is outside of our understanding, and whether or not they want to convey the truth is another matter entirely. To underpin this, I would like to share with you an experience that a close colleague of mine experienced very recently. This is not my words, but the words of Michelle Evans. This was quite recent. I went for a reading with a medium who used the board. Before I went, I was getting ready, and I said out loud, "Okay, Spirit, if you're really here with me now, here is a word that I would like you to get into my reading at some point tonight." I chose a word that wasn't obscure, but could play a part in my reading. The word was addict. The reading progressed, and not a sign of the word, although lots of info did come through that I could certainly take. The medium was about to close and asked if there are any final questions I wanted to ask. So I said, "Spirit, what was the word I shared with you earlier as confirmation?" And the planchette moved and spelt ADDICT. Although Michelle feels strongly that the experience was spiritual, she ends her recount with the question, was it me, or was it indeed the work of the spirit who had been around me all day and into the evening? We will never truly know. I shall end with a quote from Shakespeare's play Hamlet that my late father used to use and would have thought quite appropriate for this topic. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Thank you very much for your time.